My daughter-in-law grabbed my wrist before I'd even finished my second glass of champagne. Her nails dug in hard enough to leave marks. "We're leaving. Right now, Dad. Don't ask questions. Just walk with me." I set my glass down on the nearest table without a word and let her pull me through the crowd, past the string quartet, past my son laughing too loudly near the bar, out the front doors of the restaurant, into the cold parking lot. She didn't speak again until we were sitting in my truck with the doors locked and the engine off, her breath fogging in front of her face. Then she turned to me, and I saw that her eyes were wet. "Frank," she said, "did you actually read the partnership papers before you signed them? Or did you just trust him?" "My name is Frank Delacroix. I'm 68 years old, and for 41 years, I've owned and operated Delacroix Precision Machining out of a converted warehouse on the edge of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I started that shop with 2 lathes I bought used from a bankruptcy auction and a loan my own father co-signed against his house. I built it, piece by piece, contract by contract, into a company that supplies precision parts to 3 different oil and gas majors and employs 140 people, most of whom have been with me longer than my son has been alive. My wife Diane and I raised 1 child, our son Marcus, and we gave him everything. Private school, an engineering degree from LSU that I paid for in full, no loans, no debt hanging over his head when he graduated. And 2 months ago, when Marcus came to me with tears in his eyes and told me his marriage to his wife Renata was falling apart because they couldn't afford to buy out his business partner and finally own the auto restoration shop they'd built. Together, I didn't hesitate. I wired $480,000 into an escrow account to buy out that partner. I told myself it was an investment in my son's future, in my grandchildren's future, in the family name continuing to mean something in this town. Tonight was supposed to be the celebration. Marcus had rented out the back room of the nicest steakhouse in Baton Rouge to celebrate the shop becoming, in his words, fully and completely ours. 50 guests, an open bar, a banner that said Delacroix Restorations, Est, tonight in gold cursive lettering. I should have felt proud watching my son work that room, shaking hands, laughing with old high school friends who'd shown up to support him. Instead, something had been sitting wrong in my stomach since the moment Diane and I walked through the door. Marcus barely looked at me all night. Every time I tried to get close enough to talk to him, his father-in-law, a man named Gerald Prescott, materialized at his elbow like he'd been waiting for the opportunity, steering Marcus towards some other guest, some other conversation, always with a hand on my son's shoulder like he owned the boy outright. Gerald had a way of talking about the shop that bothered me all night. A proprietary way, gesturing at the room like he'd built it himself, telling stories about our plans for expansion that I'd never heard a single word about. I told myself I was being an overprotective old man who couldn't let his son stand on his own 2 feet. I was wrong. I was so wrong it makes my chest tight even now, remembering how naive I was standing in that room. Renata had gone looking for the restroom near the private offices in the back of the restaurant, the ones the owner used for his own paperwork, and she said the door to one of them was cracked open, with light spilling out into the hallway. She heard Gerald's voice inside, low and pleased with himself, talking to someone on speakerphone, and she stopped to listen because something about his tone made the hair on her arms stand up. He was talking about the buyout. He was talking about the $480,000, and he was laughing. "Frank," Renata said to me in the truck, her voice shaking so badly I had to lean in close to hear her over the sound of my own heartbeat. "The partnership agreement you signed, the one Marcus had you sign at the lawyer's office 3 weeks ago. You told me you read every page." "I read it," I said, though even as the words left my mouth I felt the first cold thread of doubt uncoiling in my gut. Marcus told me it was standard buyout language, straightforward transfer of ownership from the old partner to him and Renata jointly. I had my own attorney glance over it before I signed the wire authorization. "Your own attorney," Renata repeated, and something in the way she said it made my stomach drop straight through the floor of the truck. "Frank, the company that document actually transferred ownership to isn't Marcus's name. It isn't my name either. It's an LLC called Prescott Family Holdings. My father is the sole managing member. He owns 100% of the restoration shop right now, Frank. Not Marcus. Not me. My father owns it outright, and he used your money to buy it." I sat there in the driver's seat of my own truck, in the parking lot of a restaurant my son had rented to celebrate a lie, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, the way it used to feel 40 years ago when a supplier tried to cheat me on a shipment of raw steel, and I had to decide, right then, whether I was going to be the kind of man who let people walk all over him, or the kind of man who fought back. I had thought I'd never have to make that choice against my own blood. "Are you certain?" I asked her, my voice coming out lower and flatter than I intended. "Absolutely certain. I saw the recorded deed transfer myself, Frank. I pulled it on my phone in the hallway while he was still talking. It's filed with the parish. Prescott Family Holdings, LLC. Registered 11 days ago, right after your wire cleared." 11 days. My son had stood in my kitchen 11 days ago, eating my wife's cooking, telling me how grateful he was, how he was going to make sure Diane and I never had to worry about a thing in our old age, because the shop was finally, truly his. He had looked me directly in the eyes and lied to my face, or he had let someone else lie through him, which in my book is very nearly the same crime. I called Marcus's phone right there in the parking lot. It rang 4 times before he picked up, and I could hear the party still going behind him, glasses clinking, someone's laughter. "Dad, everything okay? Where'd you and Mom disappear to? We need to talk," I said. "Tonight, not tomorrow." There was a pause, just half a second too long, and in that half second I heard everything I needed to hear. "Dad, is this really the time? We're celebrating." "Marcus," I said, and I made my voice as calm and as even as I could manage, because I had learned a long time ago in business that the man who raises his voice first is usually the man who loses the negotiation. "Whose name is on the deed to that shop?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched out long enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears, and then, instead of my son's voice, I heard Gerald Prescott's voice come on the line, smooth and satisfied as a man settling into a hot bath. "Frank, Frank, Frank, Frank. Always so suspicious of family. Marcus is just a little tied up right now thanking our guests. Why don't you and Diane head on home and get some rest, and we'll all sit down like civilized people this week and go over the details." "Put my son back on the phone," I said. "He'll call you tomorrow," Gerald said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, and then the line went dead. I did not sleep that night. Diane cried herself into an exhausted, fitful rest around 2 in the morning, and I sat downstairs in my den, in the leather chair where I've made every important decision of my adult life, and I pulled out my laptop and logged into the parish clerk of court's online records portal. It took me 11 minutes to find exactly what Renata had described. The deed to Delacroix Restorations, formerly a 2-partner LLC, had been dissolved and reformed, and the new sole owner of record was Prescott Family Holdings, LLC, with Gerald Prescott listed as the sole managing member. My son's name did not appear anywhere on the document. Renata's name did not appear anywhere on the document. $480,000 of my money I had earned wiring precision steel components to offshore drilling platforms in the Gulf for 4 decades, had purchased a business that my own son now had zero legal claim to whatsoever. I printed every page. I sat there at 4 a.m., with the printer humming in the dark den, watching the pages come out one at a time, feeling something harden in my chest that I hadn't felt since the early years of building my company, when I'd had to fire men I liked because they were stealing from me, when I'd had to learn that loving someone and trusting someone are not always the same decision. At 7 the next morning, I drove to the restoration shop myself. Marcus had an office in the back, a small one, nothing fancy, with his name still on a temporary paper sign taped to the door because the permanent one hadn't come in yet. He was sitting behind his desk when I walked in, looking like he hadn't slept much better than I had. Dark circles under his eyes, a cold cup of coffee sitting untouched at his elbow. "Dad," he said, standing up too fast, nearly knocking his chair over. "Look, I can explain." I didn't say anything. I opened the manila folder I'd brought with me and laid the printed deed records on his desk, spreading them out so he could see every page, every line, every name that wasn't his. His face went white. I watched the blood actually drain out of it. I watched his hand tremble slightly as he picked up the top page and stared at it, like it might change if he looked at it long enough. "This isn't what it looks like," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. Dad, there's context here. Gerald explained it to me. It's temporary. It's a tax structure. I gave you $480,000, I said, and I kept my voice level, kept it quiet, because I had learned that quiet is more frightening than shouting ever was. I gave it to you because you told me your marriage was struggling, and you needed to own something outright, something that was yours, so you could build a life for my grandchildren. And instead you let your father-in-law put it in his own name, and you didn't tell me. You let me stand in that restaurant last night, in a room with a banner with my family's name on it, celebrating a lie. It's not a lie, it's a strategy, Marcus said. And now, he was reaching for a folder of his own. A slick black one, with a financial planner's logo, embossed on the cover. And I recognized the tactic before he even opened it, because I'd used similar tactics myself 30 years ago to intimidate suppliers who didn't know any better. Gerald's accountant structured it this way to protect us from a massive tax liability on the transfer. It's temporary, Dad. 90 days. The LLC dissolves and the deed reverts to me and Renata jointly. This is normal. This is how sophisticated buyers protect large asset transfers. I let him talk. I let him lay out spreadsheets full of numbers that didn't add up to anything real, projected depreciation schedules and gift tax thresholds that had nothing to do with a business buyout between family, because I have read enough contracts in my life to know a smokescreen when one is being blown directly in my face. I have built and sold and financed enough equipment, negotiated enough steel contracts, sat across enough tables from men trying to talk fast and confident to cover for something rotten that I recognized the shape of the lie, even if I couldn't yet see all the way to the bottom of it. Renata walked in halfway through his presentation, and I watched her face change the moment she saw the document spread across the desk. Watched the same wall go up in her that I'd seen go up in my son. Frank, did you go behind our backs to the courthouse? I went to a public records office, I said. I have every right to know where $480,000 of my dollars ended up. It was a gift, she snapped. And there it was, the same tactic exactly. The two of them united now, standing shoulder to shoulder against me like I was the villain in my own family's story. A gift means you trust us to handle it. This is exactly why my father said we shouldn't have told you the details, because you'd react like this, like we're criminals, instead of your own children. I felt something twist hard in my stomach, a sick, familiar feeling, the feeling of watching two people you love lie to your face in perfect harmony, like they'd rehearsed it, and maybe they had. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my hand on the desk, though God knows I wanted to. 41 years of running a machine shop full of men twice as hard-headed as any teenager taught me that the man who loses his temper loses the room. Instead, I let my shoulders drop. I let my face go slack and tired. I reached up and rubbed my eyes like a worn-out old man who'd just been beaten in an argument he didn't fully understand. And I said, very quietly, maybe you're right. Maybe I'm just old and I don't understand how these things work anymore. I watched something shift in both their faces. Relief. Relaxation. The particular ease of two people who believe they have successfully fooled an old fool. I drove home that morning, and I did not stop being afraid. But I stopped letting them see it, because something Renata had said in the truck the night before kept turning over in my mind like a stone I couldn't put down. She'd said Gerald was laughing on that phone call, laughing about more than just the shop. And a man like Gerald Prescott, a man I'd looked into years ago when Marcus first started dating Renata, and found nothing but a modest insurance salesman with 2 failed small businesses behind him, does not laugh like a man who just pulled off a $480,000 real estate maneuver. He laughs like a man who's gotten away with something much bigger and much longer than one night's deception. So I let them believe I'd folded. I told Marcus over the phone 2 days later that I understood, that I trusted his judgment, that 90 days wasn't so long to wait, and I could hear the relief flood through his voice like water through a broken dam. And then I called my company's head of finance, a woman named Sylvia who has worked for me for 26 years and who I trust more than I trust most of my own blood these days. And I asked her to quietly pull every record of every transaction Delacroix Precision Machining had processed involving Marcus's name or Gerald Prescott's name over the past 3 years. It took her 9 days. When she finally sat down across from me in my office with a thick folder of her own, her hands were shaking, and Sylvia does not shake for anything. "Frank," she said, "I need you to understand what I'm about to show you before I show it to you." 18 months ago, when Marcus had been working part-time in our accounting department before he left to pursue the restoration shop full-time, he had been given limited administrative access to our company's retirement fund management portal, purely to help with quarterly reporting. During that time, and continuing for months after he officially left the company, someone using credentials that traced back to his old login had authorized a series of transfers out of the employee pension fund, small enough individually to avoid triggering our compliance software's fraud alerts, but adding up, over 18 months, to just under $1.3 million. The money had been routed through a series of shell accounts before eventually landing, Sylvia's forensic trail showed, in accounts controlled by Gerald Prescott. I sat in my office chair and felt the floor of my entire life tilt sideways. 140 employees, men and women who had given me decades of their lives, who trusted me with their retirement, with their futures, with the security of their families, and my own son, whether through direct participation or through willful blindness, while his father-in-law used his old credentials, had let that trust be violated for over a year and a half. This was no longer a family dispute over a business buyout. This was federal wire fraud. This was theft from real people with real mortgages and real grandchildren of their own. People who called me by my first name and brought me tomatoes from their gardens every summer. I did not sleep for 3 nights straight after that. I sat with Diane at our kitchen table and told her everything, watched her face crumble and then harden into something I had not seen in her in years. A fury I recognized because it matched my own. "What are you going to do?" she asked me, and I told her the truth. I was going to finish what I'd started. I was going to let them keep believing I was a broken old man who'd rolled over, right up until the moment it no longer mattered what they believed. I hired a forensic accountant of my own, independent of the company. A sharp young woman named Priya who had once helped me untangle a supplier fraud case a decade earlier, and together with Sylvia we built a complete timeline. Every transfer, every shell account, every login timestamp, cross-referenced against Gerald Prescott's known financial holdings, including the newly acquired restoration shop, which it turned out had been purchased using a combination of the stolen pension funds and my own $480,000 wire, laundered together so cleanly that an untrained eye would never separate the two sources of money. I met with my company's attorney. I met with an FBI field agent who specializes in employee benefit plan fraud, a stone-faced man named Agent Delfino who listened to my entire story without interrupting once, and then told me, quietly, that they had actually flagged some irregular activity in a related investigation 8 months earlier, but hadn't been able to connect it to Prescott until now. My evidence, he said, closed the gap they'd been missing. 2 weeks after that meeting, on a Tuesday morning, federal agents executed a search warrant on Gerald Prescott's home and on the restoration shop simultaneously. I was not there to see it, but Sylvia called me the moment she heard, and I drove over anyway, because after everything, I needed to see it with my own eyes. Marcus was standing on the sidewalk outside the shop when I arrived, watching agents carry boxes of records out of the building he'd celebrated as his own just a few weeks before. And when he saw my truck pull up, something in his face broke open completely. "Dad," he said, walking toward me on legs that didn't look entirely steady. "Dad, please tell me you didn't do this." "I didn't do anything," I told him. And for the first time in weeks, I let every ounce of the fury I'd been carrying show plainly on my face. "You and Gerald did this. I just made sure the people you stole from finally got to see the truth." "I didn't know about the pension fund," he said, and he was crying now, right there on the sidewalk, in front of agents and neighbors, and the gold cursive banner still hanging crooked in the shop's front window. "Dad, I swear to you, I didn't know what he was doing with those old login credentials. I thought the shop deal was just a tax thing. I swear on my life, I didn't know about the rest of it. I wanted to believe him. God help me, some small, foolish, fatherly part of me wanted so badly to believe him. But I had spent 41 years learning to read men who were lying to me across a negotiating table. And I looked at my own son's face, and I could not honestly tell, whether what I was looking at was innocence or just a very good performance of it, and that uncertainty was its own kind of devastation, worse in some ways than certainty would have been. "You let him use your name," I said. Whether you knew what he was doing with it or not, you let him use your name and my money, and 140 families almost paid the price for it. That's not nothing, Marcus. That's not something I can just set down and forget. The investigation moved fast once the federal case was built. Gerald Prescott was indicted within 6 weeks on multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement from an employee benefit plan, facing enough combined prison time that his own attorney reportedly advised him a plea deal was his only realistic option. Renata filed for divorce from Marcus within the month, not out of malice toward him specifically. She told Diane in a tearful phone call, but because she could no longer stand to be anywhere near her father's name and Marcus's connection to it without feeling sick. The restoration shop, seized as part of the federal forfeiture proceedings, was sold at auction, and every dollar recovered went first toward restoring the stolen pension funds, with what remained held for restitution proceedings. Marcus lost his job at the accounting firm he'd taken a position with after leaving the shop, once his name surfaced in local news coverage of the case, even though the federal prosecutors ultimately declined to charge him directly, citing insufficient evidence that he had knowingly participated in the pension fraud itself, rather than merely benefiting, however unwittingly, from its proceeds. He lost his apartment 3 months after that. He called me twice during that stretch, and both times I let the phone ring out, because I did not yet trust myself to speak to him without saying something I couldn't take back, and because some wounds need silence to begin closing before words can do any good at all. It was late November, cold for Louisiana, sleeting rain turning the roads to black glass, when he finally showed up at my house unannounced, standing on my front porch in a jacket too thin for the weather, soaked through, his hair plastered flat against his skull. I opened the door and looked at my son standing there shivering, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. "Dad," he finally said, and his voice was raw, stripped down to something I hadn't heard from him since he was a boy waking up from a nightmare. "I know I don't deserve to ask you for anything. I know that. I'm not asking to stay. I'm not asking for money. I just need somewhere dry for one night. I'll be gone before you're even awake tomorrow. Please, Dad. I have nowhere else." I stood in my doorway and looked at the rain running down my son's face, mixing with what might have been tears, or might have just been the storm, and I thought about 140 families whose retirements had nearly been stolen out from under them by men who thought their names and their comfort mattered more than anyone else's. I thought about Sylvia, 26 years of loyal service, sitting across from me with shaking hands. I thought about the gold banner in that restaurant, Delacroix Restorations, Est, tonight, and how proud I had felt for exactly the length of one champagne glass before my whole world tilted sideways. "You can sleep in the shop," I told him, and I watched a flicker of hope cross his face before I finished the sentence. "Not this house. There's a cot in the break room at Delacroix Precision. Sylvia will let you in. But Marcus, listen to me carefully, because I am only going to say this once. This is not forgiveness. This is not a door reopening. This is a roof over your head for one cold night because you are still my son, and I am not the kind of man who lets anyone freeze to death on my watch, guilty or not. Tomorrow you find your own way forward, and you do it knowing that trust, once it's spent the way you spent mine, does not come back just because you're standing on my porch crying in the rain." He nodded, and something in his shoulders collapsed, some final hope he'd been carrying finally releasing, and he turned and walked back out into the storm toward his car without another word, because he understood, I think, for the first time, exactly what he had actually lost. I stepped back inside and closed my own front door, gently this time, not slamming it, and I stood in the warm hallway of the house Diane and I had built our whole life inside of, listening to the rain against the windows. Diane was waiting for me in the living room, sitting near the fireplace with a blanket across her lap, and she looked up at me with a question in her eyes that she didn't need to ask out loud. "He'll be all right," I told her, sitting down beside her and taking her hand in mine, though I wasn't entirely certain I believed it. "Or he won't be. But that's his to carry now, not ours." We sat together by the fire while the storm worked itself out over Baton Rouge, and I thought about all the years I'd spent believing that giving my son everything, every advantage, every dollar, every soft landing, was the same thing as loving him well. I understand now that it wasn't. Real love asks harder questions than a blank check ever does. It asks whether the people you're protecting have earned the protection, or whether you've simply made it too easy for them to never have to find out who they really are until it's too late for everyone around them. I think about the 140 families at my company more than I think about my son these days, if I'm honest. I think about Sylvia's shaking hands and the tomatoes from her garden every summer, and how close all of that came to being stolen out from under her by a man wearing my own family's name as cover. Blood is supposed to mean something, but I've learned, at 68 years old, after 41 years of building something real with my own two hands, that blood only means what you allow it to mean, and that the people who deserve your trust are the ones who protect it, not the ones who spend it on themselves and expect you to thank them for the privilege of being robbed. If you've ever had to choose between the family you were given and the people who actually earned your loyalty, you already know exactly how heavy that choice sits in your chest. Long after the storm has passed and the house has gone quiet again,